The hurricane had already passed. The evacuation shelter was supposed to be the safe part. Hundreds of people packed into a Florida gymnasium, the air thick with heat, children crying, volunteers overwhelmed, everyone waiting for things to get better. A powerful woman held her 2-year-old daughter and believed she understood what was wrong. The child was shaking. The mother thought she was cold, so she held her tighter, wrapped her in blankets, shut out every voice that tried to interrupt her certainty, including the voice of a 15-year-old black boy standing just a few feet away. He saw the signs no one else did: the rapid breathing, the burning skin, the cough that wasn't just a cough. When he tried to warn her, she dismissed him. When he tried again, she humiliated him. Minutes later, the child's body stiffened, her eyes rolled back, and the shelter went silent, because in that moment it became painfully clear the person everyone had ignored was the only one who knew how to save her. The storm had passed, but it had not truly left. What remained was heat, thick, unmoving heat that clung to the skin and made every breath feel heavier than it should. The temporary evacuation center, once a high school gymnasium, was now packed far beyond its limits. Rows of cots stretched wall to wall. Families sat shoulder to shoulder on the floor. The air smelled of damp clothing, disinfectant, and exhaustion. Power flickered intermittently. Overhead lights hummed, dimmed, then surged back on, as if unsure whether they were meant to stay. Portable fans rattled uselessly, pushing warm air from one corner to another. Outside, the sky was bright again, almost deceptively calm, but the damage from the hurricane was visible in every direction: fallen trees, flooded streets, shattered windows. Inside, the sense of waiting was unbearable. Laura Kensington stepped into the gymnasium with the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of being listened to. She did not raise her voice, but people noticed her anyway. She wore practical clothes now, no tailored suit, no heels, but even stripped of her usual symbols of power, she carried herself like someone accustomed to control. In her arms was her daughter, Charlotte. Lottie was 2 years old, small and flushed, her head resting limply against Laura's shoulder. Her hair was damp with sweat. Her breathing was shallow, faster than it should have been, but Laura dismissed it as discomfort. Everyone was uncomfortable here. Everyone was tired. Laura scanned the room with visible irritation. There were too many people, too much noise, too much chaos. Children cried. Someone coughed relentlessly a few rows away. Volunteers moved quickly from one group to another, their faces strained, their shirts darkened with sweat. This was not how things were supposed to work. She approached the registration table and made her expectations clear. She needed water. She needed a cot closer to the fans. She needed space. Her child was young, vulnerable, and should not be exposed to conditions like this. The volunteers nodded, apologized, explained that they were overwhelmed, that supplies were limited, that everyone here had needs. Their voices were calm, practiced, and tired. Laura accepted none of it well. She turned away, clutching Lottie closer, muttering under her breath as she searched for a place to sit. The heat pressed in from all sides. Sweat trickled down her spine. Lottie stirred weakly, her small body warm, almost too warm, but Laura wrapped the thin blanket tighter around her anyway. The building was cold during the storm, she told herself. Damp, drafty. This was just the after effect. A few rows away, Elijah Brooks moved quietly between people. At 15, He was tall for his age, but still carried the leanness of someone who had not fully grown into his body. He wore a faded t-shirt, jeans and sneakers worn thin at the soles. His hair was cropped close. His movements were purposeful but careful, as if he were constantly aware of taking up too much space. He wasn't an official volunteer. He didn't have a vest or a badge. He was simply helping because there was work to be done. Elijah adjusted a folding cot so an elderly woman could sit more comfortably. He helped a volunteer untangle extension cords connected to a generator. He pointed a family toward the water station when they looked lost. He did these things without drawing attention to himself. He noticed Laura Kensington the moment she entered, not because she was loud, but because she stood out, tense, impatient, clearly out of place among people who had already accepted that control was no longer an option. He noticed the child in her arms next, the flushed cheeks, the sheen of sweat, the way the little girl's head lolled slightly when Laura shifted her weight. Elijah slowed. He watched for a moment, eyes narrowing, not in judgment, but in concern. The child coughed, a small, wet sound. Then again, Laura brushed it off, bouncing her gently, her jaw tight with frustration. She glanced around and caught Elijah looking. Her expression hardened instantly. "Is there a problem?" she asked sharply. Elijah hesitated. He was used to this look, suspicion, annoyance, the unspoken question of why he thought he had the right to look, to notice, to say anything at all. "No, ma'am," he said. "I just thought—" She cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Then keep moving." Her tone was not loud, but it carried. A few nearby people glanced over, then quickly looked away. Elijah nodded and stepped back, but his attention didn't leave the child. Laura turned her body slightly, shielding Lottie from him as if his gaze alone were intrusive. She pulled the blanket tighter, murmuring about the cold, about how irresponsible this whole operation was, about how no one here seemed to know what they were doing. Elijah returned to helping where he could, but the image stayed with him. The child's breathing, the heat of the room, the cough. He had seen it before. Not exactly this, not here, but enough to recognize when something didn't feel right. The evacuation center continued to hum with restless energy. People waited for updates, for power, for transportation, for news of homes they weren't sure still existed. Volunteers rushed from one minor crisis to another, their radios crackling constantly. Laura sat stiffly on a cot, Lottie still in her arms. The child had gone quiet now, too quiet. Her eyes were half closed. Her body was limp with fatigue. Laura told herself this was normal. The storm had been terrifying. Of course her daughter was exhausted. Of course she was warm. The air was unbearable. Still, an unease settled in her chest, unwelcome and sharp. She adjusted Lottie again, pressing a hand to her daughter's back, and felt the heat there, intense, concentrated. Across the room, Elijah paused, watching once more. He said nothing. Not yet. The storm might have ended, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. And in the crowded heat of that shelter, among people who had already lost so much, something was quietly, dangerously wrong. Elijah noticed the change before anyone else did. It was subtle at first, the kind of shift people missed when they were tired, overheated, and distracted by their own losses. Charlotte coughed again, harder this time. Not a dry sound, but wet and rattling, as if it came from deep in her chest. Her breathing followed too quickly, shallow and uneven, her small ribcage working harder than it should have been. Elijah slowed his steps. The heat in the shelter had grown heavier, As the afternoon dragged on, sweat clung to skin. Children lay sprawled across cots, glassy-eyed and overstimulated. In this kind of environment, illness didn't announce itself loudly. It slipped in quietly, hiding behind fatigue and stress. Charlotte's face was flushed now, the red deeper than before. Her skin glistened, not just with sweat, but with heat that seemed trapped beneath the surface. When Laura adjusted her grip, Elijah saw the child's head fall back slightly, unsupported for a brief second, before Laura pulled her closer. Too close. Elijah stopped near the edge of the aisle, pretending to fix a loose cot strap. He watched without staring, his gaze trained, deliberate. The girl's breathing was fast, too fast. He weighed his options. He had learned early on when to speak and when silence was safer. People rarely welcomed concern from someone who looked like him, sounded like him, and, most importantly, was his age. Still, the signs were stacking up in his mind, one on top of another, forming a picture he didn't like. The cough, the heat, the breathing. Elijah wiped his palms against his jeans and stepped closer. "Ma'am," he said carefully, keeping his voice low and even. "I don't think she's cold." Laura looked at him as if he'd said something obscene. "What did you just say?" Her voice was sharp, edged with disbelief. Elijah didn't raise his volume. "She's really warm, and she's breathing fast. I think she might have a fever." The words barely had time to settle before Laura's expression hardened completely. "That's ridiculous," she said. "This place is damp. Of course she's cold." She pulled the thin blanket tighter around Charlotte, pressing the child's body firmly against her chest, as if proximity alone could correct whatever was wrong. Charlotte whimpered weakly, her head turning into Laura's shoulder. Elijah felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "She's sweating," he said, unable to stop himself now. "And the coughing," Laura cut him off with a sharp laugh, the sound brittle and humorless. "Listen," she said, standing slightly so she could look down at him. "You don't know my child, and you certainly don't know better than I do." Her words were measured, but the meaning beneath them was not. A few people nearby glanced over. Elijah became acutely aware of his height, his clothes, the way his presence read to others before he ever spoke. "She needs to be warm," Laura continued, not bothered by random kids who think they know something. Elijah felt the familiar heat rise behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, but the dull ache of being dismissed before the conversation had even begun. "I'm just trying to help," he said quietly. Laura's gaze swept over him, slow and assessing, taking in his skin, his age, his lack of any visible authority. "Help," she repeated. "By doing what, exactly? Plain doctor?" The word landed heavy. She turned her body further away from him, shielding Charlotte completely now. The message was clear. The conversation was over, and he was not welcome in it. "Go find something useful to do," Laura added. "Or better yet, leave this to people who are qualified." Elijah stepped back. He nodded once, out of habit more than agreement, and returned to the other side of the aisle. He helped a volunteer lift a box of bottled water. He handed out paper towels. He kept moving, but his attention never fully left Charlotte. Laura sat rigidly on the cot, her jaw clenched. She rocked Charlotte slightly, murmuring reassurances that sounded more like commands than comfort. She told herself she was right. She had raised this child. She knew her body. She knew when something was wrong, and this was not that. Charlotte stirred again, coughing harder now, her small body tensing with the effort. Her breathing hitched, then resumed even faster than before. Laura pressed a hand to her daughter's back and frowned. The heat startled her this time. It wasn't just warmth, it was intense, concentrated, almost alarming. Laura shifted Charlotte away from her chest just enough to look at her face. The child's eyes were half-lidded, unfocused. Her lips were parted as she breathed, each breath shallow and quick. Laura's irritation wavered, replaced by a flicker of unease. "She's just tired," Laura muttered more to herself than anyone else. "This day has been a nightmare." She adjusted the blanket again, tightening it reflexively, the way she always did when Charlotte fussed. The motion was automatic, instinctive, shaped by years of responding to discomfort with warmth and closeness. Across the room, Elijah watched the blanket being pulled tighter. He exhaled slowly through his nose. He had seen this pattern before. Not the people, not the place, but the mistake. Fever mistaken for cold. Illness mistaken for exhaustion. Concern dismissed because it came from the wrong mouth. He scanned the room for a volunteer, but every one of them was already engaged. Kneeling beside a crying child, speaking urgently into a radio, guiding an elderly man toward the restrooms. The system wasn't failing. It was overwhelmed. Elijah looked back at Charlotte. Her breathing had become audible now, a faint wheeze threading through each inhale. Her chest moved rapidly beneath the blanket. Sweat beaded along her hairline. He felt a surge of urgency push past his hesitation. "Ma'am," he said again, stepping closer despite himself. "Please, she's not cold. She's burning up." Laura turned on him instantly. "I told you to stay away from us." Her voice was louder this time, sharp enough to draw attention. Heads turned, conversations paused. "I don't know who you think you are," Laura continued, her words clipped and cutting. "But you don't get to insert yourself into my life. You don't get to scare me with nonsense because you're bored." Elijah's throat tightened. "I'm not trying to scare you," he said. "I just—" "Enough." Laura stood fully now, looming over him. Charlotte clutched protectively against her chest. "I will not have some random black kid telling me how to care for my child." The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. A few people nearby shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. Elijah felt something settle inside him, cold and steady. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply stepped back again, putting space between them. Laura turned away, heart pounding, her confidence shaken despite her anger. She bounced Charlotte gently, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed anymore. Charlotte coughed again. Longer, harder. Laura felt it then, the tremor beneath the cough, the way her daughter's body seemed to stiffen for a brief, terrifying moment before relaxing again. Her breath caught. Across the room, Elijah froze. He knew that sound, and whatever assumptions had ruled the room until now were about to be tested. Illness moved differently after a disaster. It did not arrive with urgency or clarity. It did not announce itself. It blended into exhaustion, into dehydration, into the fog that followed fear and loss. In crowded shelters, sickness rarely stood out. It hid behind crying children, behind adults who had gone too long without sleep, behind bodies pushed past what they were meant to endure. Respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, thrived in places like this. Warm, enclosed spaces, shared air, dozens of children coughing into the same heavy atmosphere, parents wiping noses with whatever cloth they had left, volunteers moving from one family to another without time to pause, to sanitize, to separate. Elijah Brooks knew this. He had learned it from pamphlets his mother brought home from clinics, from articles he had read late at night on an old phone with a cracked screen, from watching younger kids in his neighborhood get sick every winter, their parents unsure when a cough crossed the line into danger. RSV was common. That was what made it dangerous. Most people thought of it as a cold, something children got over, something mild, but for toddlers, especially under 3, it could turn fast. Elijah stood near the water station, handing out bottles while his attention remained fixed on Charlotte Kensington. Her cough had deepened, each one rattling in her chest like something loose and trapped. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the shelter. A low wheeze layered beneath her breathing. Her chest moved rapidly now, in and out, in and out. Too fast for a child her age? Elijah counted silently, timing her breaths between coughs. The number climbed higher than it should have. Her skin still glistened with sweat. Heat radiated from her, even from several feet away. And when she shifted in Laura's arms, her movements were sluggish, delayed, as if her body was struggling to keep up with itself. Elijah felt a familiar tension settle into his shoulders. This wasn't just fever. He watched as Laura adjusted the blanket again, tucking it tighter around Charlotte's torso. The child whimpered faintly, her head lolling against her mother's shoulder. Heat trapped, air restricted, a small body working harder and harder just to breathe. Elijah stepped away from the water station and moved toward the cluster of volunteers near the far wall. Radios crackled nonstop. One volunteer knelt beside an elderly man whose hands shook uncontrollably. Another was trying to calm a child with a bleeding knee. A third argued quietly with someone over missing medication. No one looked up. Elijah waited, then spoke to the nearest volunteer when there was a brief opening. He kept his words simple, factual. There was a toddler with a high fever, rapid breathing, a worsening cough, possible RSV. The volunteer listened, nodding automatically, eyes already drifting past Elijah toward the next problem demanding attention. She asked where the child was, glanced in that direction, and exhaled slowly. "We're doing our best," she said. "We've got a dozen kids with fevers right now." Her voice wasn't dismissive. It was exhausted. Elijah understood. He nodded, stepped back, and watched as she was immediately pulled away by a call on her radio. Another emergency, another decision made under pressure. The system was stretched too thin to catch subtlety. Back near the cots, Charlotte's breathing grew louder. A faint wheezing sound accompanied each exhale now, barely audible unless someone was listening for it. Elijah was listening. RSV inflamed the small airways first. It made breathing laborious. It exhausted children quickly. Fever followed, and when fever climbed too high, especially in toddlers, the brain could misfire. Febrile seizures were rare, but not rare enough. Elijah swallowed. He moved closer again, stopping just short of where Laura sat. He did not touch. He did not raise his voice. He simply observed. Charlotte's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused, then closed again. Her body went still for a moment, unnaturally so. Elijah's pulse quickened. He spoke again, choosing his words with care. He explained, quietly, that RSV could look like this, that it often worsened in crowded shelters, that high fever could escalate quickly in children her age. Laura barely looked at him. Her attention flickered between Charlotte's face and the chaos around them. Her irritation had faded, replaced by something tighter, more brittle, fear poorly disguised. "This is just a virus," she said, more insistently than before. "Kids get sick." Elijah didn't argue with that. RSV was just a virus until it wasn't. Charlotte coughed again, her small body stiffening briefly with the effort. Her breathing resumed, faster now, almost frantic. A sheen of sweat soaked into the collar of her shirt. Her skin was hot to the touch, far hotter than it should have been. Elijah glanced toward the volunteers again, still overwhelmed, still moving triage to triage, forced to prioritize what screamed loudest. RSV didn't scream. It whispered. The shelter felt smaller by the minute. The air thickened as evening approached, humidity pressing down like a weight. Children sprawled across laps and cots, many coughing now, noses running, faces flushed. The virus moved freely, invisible and unchecked. Laura shifted Charlotte in her arms, adjusting her grip as the child's head rolled back slightly. For a split second, Charlotte's neck went slack. Elijah's breath caught. He stepped forward again, closer than before. "She's getting worse," he said. His voice remained steady, but urgency threaded through it now. "Her breathing is too fast. She's burning up." Laura snapped her head up, anger flashing briefly before faltering. A doubt flickered across her face. She pressed her palm against Charlotte's back and froze. The heat startled her. Again, more this time. It wasn't just warmth, it was alarming. Charlotte made a small, strained sound. Not quite a cry, not quite a cough. Laura's grip tightened reflexively. Across the room, a volunteer shouted for help. Somewhere else, a child began to scream. The shelter surged with sound and motion. Elijah stayed focused on the one thing that mattered. RSV could progress rapidly. High fever could overwhelm a toddler's nervous system. The window for intervention narrowed quickly once warning signs appeared. He looked at Charlotte's hands. They trembled slightly. His stomach dropped. He tried once more to get a volunteer's attention, raising his hand, calling out over the noise. One glanced his way, but was immediately redirected by another urgent call. No one was ignoring them on purpose. There were simply too many people who needed help. Elijah turned back to Laura. He saw it now, the moment where denial met reality. The way her posture had shifted, the way she held Charlotte not with confidence, but with uncertainty. The assumptions that had guided her so far about control, about authority, about who knew best, were beginning to crack. Charlotte's breathing hitched. Then, suddenly, her body stiffened, just for a fraction of a second. Elijah recognized it instantly. His heart slammed against his ribs. RSV, high fever, rapid breathing, decreased responsiveness. This was no longer subtle. Whatever happened next would happen fast. And in the crowded heat of the shelter, with the system stretched beyond its limits, the difference between watching and acting was about to matter more than anything else. The change came without warning. One moment Charlotte lay limp in Laura's arms, her breathing rapid and uneven. The next, her body stiffened violently, as if seized by an invisible force. Her small limbs jerked, first sharply, then rhythmically. Her head snapped back, her jaw clenched. For a split second, Laura did not understand what she was seeing. Her mind searched for explanations that felt safer. Fatigue, shock, cold, but none of them fit the reality unfolding in her arms. Charlotte's eyes rolled back, showing only white. A thin, strangled sound escaped her throat. Then the sound stopped. Laura screamed. She clutched her daughter tighter, instinctively pulling Charlotte against her chest, wrapping the blanket fully around her small body. Her hands shook as she pressed her cheek to Charlotte's forehead, trying to anchor her, to warm her, to stop whatever was happening through sheer will. People turned. Conversations broke apart. The shelter shifted as attention snapped toward the sudden crisis. "My baby," Laura cried, her voice breaking. "She's freezing." The words spilled out automatically, reflexively, clinging to the explanation she had held on to all day. Cold was something she understood. Cold could be fixed. Cold meant blankets, closeness, control. She rocked Charlotte back and forth, tightening her hold, even as the child's body continued to convulse in her arms. The heat beneath the blanket intensified. Elijah Brooks was already moving. He crossed the aisle in 3 long strides, stopping just short of Laura. His chest tightened at the sight of Charlotte's rigid body, her movements no longer coordinated, no longer purposeful. This was not shivering. This was not discomfort. This was a seizure. He forced himself to stay calm. Panic made people dangerous. Panic made them do the wrong things. Charlotte's skin was burning now, flushed a deep, alarming red. Her breathing came in harsh, irregular bursts between convulsions. The wheezing sound that had worried him earlier was still there, threaded beneath the seizure, faint but unmistakable. Elijah scanned the space around them. People had crowded closer, forming a loose circle. Someone shouted for help. A volunteer across the room looked up, started toward them, and then stopped, redirected by another emergency breaking out near the doors. A child had collapsed. An elderly man was struggling to breathe. Radios crackled with overlapping voices. The volunteers weren't choosing not to come. They couldn't. Laura's mind splintered under the weight of fear. She pressed Charlotte harder against her body, rocking her faster now, whispering frantically. Her movements were desperate, uncontrolled. She pulled the blanket tighter, tucking it under Charlotte's chin, trapping heat against her chest. "She's cold," Laura repeated, her voice shrill with terror. "She needs to be warm." Elijah stepped closer. "Ma'am," he said louder now, cutting through the noise. "She's having a seizure." Laura didn't hear him, or perhaps she did, but the words could not penetrate the wall of panic closing in around her. Charlotte's body jerked again, harder this time. A thin line of saliva appeared at the corner of her mouth. Elijah's stomach clenched. He raised his voice, just enough. "She's too hot. You need to let go." That broke through. Laura's head snapped up. Her eyes were wild, unfocused, darting between Charlotte's face and Elijah's. "Don't touch her," she snapped. "Get away from us." But her grip faltered. Doubt flickered across her face as another convulsion rippled through Charlotte's small body. The blanket slipped slightly, and Elijah saw the truth beneath it, the flushed skin, the sweat-soaked clothing, the way heat radiated from the child in waves. Laura felt it too. For the first time, the sensation beneath her hands did not match the story she had been telling herself. This wasn't cold. This was burning. Her breath hitched. Charlotte's movement slowed briefly, then resumed, weaker now, more erratic. Her breathing grew shallow, uneven, as if her body was tiring faster than it could recover. Elijah did not wait for permission. He reached out, not to grab Charlotte, but to steady Laura's arms. "Please," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "She needs air. She needs space." Laura hesitated, frozen between instinct and reality. Every part of her wanted to resist, to protect, to maintain control. But the weight of Charlotte's body in her arms had changed. She felt heavier somehow, less responsive, the illusion of authority, the belief that her position, her certainty, Her force of will could fix this, crumbled in an instant. Her knees buckled. Elijah reacted immediately, guiding her down onto the cot so Charlotte would not fall. The movement broke the circle of onlookers, forcing them to step back. "Give them space!" someone shouted. Elijah pulled the blanket away from Charlotte's torso, exposing her overheated skin to the air. The child's body continued to twitch, smaller now, weaker. Laura stared, horrified, as the blanket was removed. "No," she whispered. "She'll get cold." Elijah shook his head. "She's overheating." Charlotte's breathing rasped loudly, her chest rising and falling far too quickly. The seizure slowed, then paused, then resumed again, shorter this time, like aftershocks. Elijah looked around desperately for a volunteer, for medical equipment, for anything, but the shelter remained in controlled chaos, crises stacked on top of each other, each demanding attention, each urgent in its own way. No one came, not because they didn't care, because there was no one left to send. Elijah focused back on Charlotte. This was the moment that mattered. RSV, high fever, seizure. He had read about this, studied it, watched videos, practiced, scenarios in his head more times than he could count. Knowledge he had never expected to need like this, in a place like this. Laura sat on the edge of the cot, shaking now, her hands hovering uselessly over her daughter. Tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision. She had never felt so powerless in her life. All her influence, all her confidence, all her certainty, none of it mattered here. The shelter did not care who she was. The virus did not care. Charlotte's body jerked once more, then stilled abruptly. For half a second, everything went quiet. Laura let out a broken sob. Elijah leaned in, his eyes fixed on Charlotte's chest. It still moved, fast, shallow, but moving. The seizure had not fully ended, but it was shifting. He knew what had to happen next, and he knew there was no time left for hesitation. The storm outside had passed. Inside, the real crisis had only just begun. Eli did not think of it as stepping up. There was no moment of decision, no internal speech about courage or responsibility. There was only the narrowing of the world down to one small body lying on a cot, burning with heat, breathing too fast, moving in dangerous, erratic bursts. RSV, high fever, febrile seizure. The sequence locked into place in his mind with frightening clarity. Around them the shelter churned on. Radios crackled. Voices overlapped. Someone cried out for help at the far end of the gym. The noise pressed in from every direction, chaotic and overwhelming. Eli raised his voice, not in anger, not in panic, but with the sharp authority of necessity. "Please, give us space." It cut through the din just enough. People hesitated, then stepped back, uncertain but responsive to the urgency in his tone. The loose circle widened. Air moved again, warm but no longer trapped. Charlotte lay on her back, her small chest rising and falling far too quickly. Her skin was slick with sweat, flushed an alarming red. The convulsions had slowed, but her body still twitched faintly, like an engine misfiring. Eli dropped to his knees beside the cot. He did not look at Laura at first. He could feel her presence, collapsed at the edge of the cot, shaking, hands hovering uselessly over her daughter. But he could not afford distraction. The first rule was simple. Heat had to escape. Eli carefully loosened the blanket completely and set it aside. Then, with quick practice movements, he began removing Charlotte's outer layers. Gentle, efficient, exposing overheated skin to the open air. He avoided unnecessary motion, mindful that sudden movements could prolong the seizure. Charlotte whimpered faintly, her breathing hitching. Eli paused just long enough to assess her airway. Her mouth was slightly open. There was saliva at the corner of her lips. He wiped it away with his sleeve, then adjusted her position, rolling her gently onto her side. The recovery position. It kept the airway clear. It prevented aspiration if she vomited. It was one of the first things he had ever learned. Around them, the shelter seemed to hold its breath. Laura watched, frozen, horror and hope warring on her face. Every instinct screamed at her to pull Charlotte back, to cover her, to hold her tight. But something in Eli's movements, calm, deliberate, unhurried, kept her still. It was not chaos. This was control. Eli looked up briefly. "I need towels or cloths. Clean if possible." Someone nearby scrambled to help. A woman handed him a thin towel. Another offered a t-shirt. Eli nodded once in thanks. He dipped the towel into a nearby cooler of water, testing it against his wrist. Not cold, never cold. Warm, slightly below body temperature. Perfect. He wrung it out carefully, then placed it across Charlotte's forehead. Steam did not rise, but the contrast was immediate. Charlotte's skin glistened beneath the cloth, heat slowly transferring away. Eli moved methodically. He wiped gently along her temples, her neck, under her arms, along the crease of her groin, areas where blood vessels ran close to the surface, where heat could be released efficiently. He did not rush. Rapid cooling could shock the body. It had to be gradual, controlled. Charlotte's breathing remained fast, but the pitch of it began to change, less frantic, slightly more rhythmic. The wheezing softened, though it did not disappear entirely. Eli replaced the cloth, rewarmed it, repeated the process. Time stretched. Laura sank fully to her knees beside the cot, tears streaming freely now. She clasped her hands together, pressing them to her mouth, her shoulders shaking. "Please," she whispered, "please." Eli did not respond, not because he didn't hear her, but because every second of his attention belonged to Charlotte. He watched her chest, counted breaths, noticed the subtle shift as her body began to settle, the aftershocks of the seizure fading into smaller, weaker tremors. Charlotte let out a soft, broken cry. It was the most beautiful sound Eli had ever heard. He replaced the cloth once more, checking her temperature with the back of his hand. Still hot, but no longer blazing. Progress. Around them, a volunteer finally pushed through the crowd, breathless, eyes wide as she took in the scene. She stopped short when she saw Eli working. For a moment she said nothing. Then she knelt on the other side of the cot, mirroring his movements, ready to assist. Eli gave her a quick update, short, factual. RSV suspected. Febrile seizure, cooling in progress. Airway clear. She nodded, immediately understanding. Laura looked up at the volunteer, desperation etched into her face. She was freezing, she said weakly. "I thought—" The volunteer did not correct her. There would be time for that later. Eli continued. Charlotte's breathing slowed incrementally. Her chest no longer fluttered with each breath. Her limbs relaxed, the rigid tension draining away. Minutes passed. The shelter noise gradually crept back in as people realized the immediate danger had eased. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else wiped tears from their eyes. Eli stayed where he was. He replaced the towel again, careful not to overdo it. Cooling had to stop once the seizure resolved fully. overshooting could be just as dangerous. Charlotte's eyelids fluttered, then slowly they opened. Her gaze was unfocused at first, drifting past faces and ceiling lights, but there was awareness there now, confused, fragile, but present. She whimpered softly. Laura sobbed aloud, collapsing forward until her forehead rested against the edge of the cot. Her hands reached out, stopping just short of touching Charlotte, afraid to disrupt whatever fragile balance had been restored. Eli finally allowed himself to exhale. He leaned back slightly, muscles trembling now that the urgency had passed. Adrenaline drained from his system, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Charlotte turned her head weakly, her eyes finding her mother. "Mama," she murmured, barely audible. Laura broke. She pressed a kiss to Charlotte's hair, tears falling freely now, no longer restrained by pride or anger or certainty. She did not pull her close. She did not cover her. She simply stayed. Eli began to gather the towels, wringing them out, setting them aside. His hands shook faintly, though his movements remained precise. Only now did he look at Laura. She met his gaze, her eyes red and swollen, stripped of everything she had been when she walked into the shelter. Powerless, grateful, human. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Eli nodded once. He did not smile. He did not answer. He turned his attention back to Charlotte, monitoring her breathing, watching for any sign of recurrence. This wasn't over yet, but the worst had passed. For the first time since the storm, something fragile and real settled over the shelter. Hope, and it had come not from authority or status or control, but from knowledge, calm, and the willingness to act when no one else could. The seizure did not end all at once. It loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, as if the body itself needed time to remember how to let go. Charlotte's limbs relaxed in small increments, the rigid tension draining away until her arms lay heavy against the cot. The frantic jerking faded into faint tremors, then into stillness. Her breathing changed next. What had been sharp and uneven softened, each breath stretching slightly longer than the last. The wheeze that had threaded through her chest dulled, becoming less urgent, less desperate. Air moved in and out again. Not easily, not perfectly, but steadily. Eli stayed exactly where he was. He did not rush to declare anything over. He did not allow himself relief yet. He watched Charlotte's chest rise and fall, counted each breath, felt the rhythm settle into something closer to normal. His hand hovered near her shoulder, not touching, ready if her body betrayed them again. The towel lay warm against her skin now, no longer pulling heat so aggressively. He removed it gently, checking her temperature with the back of his hand. Still warm, but no longer dangerous. That difference mattered more than anything. The shelter seemed to exhale with him. The immediate crowd thinned as people returned to their own waiting, their own worries. The noise level rose gradually, cautiously, as if afraid to disturb whatever fragile calm had settled over the cot. Radios crackled again. Footsteps echoed against the gym floor. Life, messy and relentless, resumed its forward motion. Charlotte stirred. It was a small movement at first, a slight twitch of her fingers, a faint sound in her throat. Her eyelids fluttered, struggling against heaviness, then lifted just enough to reveal unfocused eyes. She blinked slowly. The world returned to her in fragments, light, sound, the dull ache of exhaustion, confusion layered over fear she could not yet name. Her gaze drifted, unfixed until it landed on her mother's face. Laura had not realized she was holding her breath until it escaped her in a sob. She collapsed forward again, one hand braced against the cot to keep herself upright, the other hovering near Charlotte's arm, still afraid to touch too much, too soon. Tears streamed freely now, unchecked, soaking into the fabric of her sleeve. Charlotte made a small sound, more breath than voice, but it was intentional. Her eyes focused. Recognition bloomed slowly. Laura pressed her lips together, shaking, and finally reached out, resting her hand lightly against Charlotte's forearm. The skin beneath her fingers was still warm, but not scorching, real, alive. Charlotte's mouth moved again. Mama. The word was faint, imperfect, but it landed with devastating force. Laura's composure shattered completely. She covered her mouth with her free hand, shoulders heaving, as the reality of what had almost happened crashed over her. The certainty she had clung to all day, that she knew, that she was in control, that nothing truly bad could happen to her, crumbled under the weight of that single moment. She had been wrong, and her daughter had nearly paid for it. Eli leaned back slightly, his knees stiff, muscles trembling, now that the urgency had passed. Adrenaline drained from his system, leaving exhaustion in its wake. He wiped his palms against his jeans, noticing only now how much they shook. Charlotte's breathing continued to slow. Her chest rose and fell in a more even rhythm, the frantic edge gone. She turned her head weakly, eyes tracking movement, absorbing the world again. Eli adjusted her position once more, keeping her on her side, careful not to disrupt her airway. He checked for any renewed stiffness, any sign of recurrence. Nothing. The worst had passed. A volunteer returned, this time with space to stay. She knelt beside the cot, checking vitals, monitoring Charlotte's breathing and responsiveness. She nodded to Eli, not in surprise, not in judgment, but in quiet acknowledgement. Laura watched the exchange from the edge of the cot. For the first time since she had entered the shelter, she truly saw him. Not as a nuisance, not as a child out of place, not as someone beneath her notice. She saw the steadiness in his movements, the restraint, the care, the way he watched her daughter, not possessively, not proudly, but attentively, as if Charlotte's continued breathing was the only thing that mattered. Understanding settled over her slowly, painfully. The boy she had dismissed, the boy she had insulted, the boy she had told to stay away, he had saved her child. Laura's gaze dropped to the floor, shame blooming hot and sharp in her chest. She felt the weight of her earlier words pressed down on her now, impossible to escape or soften. There was no justification that could undo them. She looked back up at Eli. Her voice came out raw, stripped of authority and defensiveness. "Thank you." The words felt small compared to what they carried. Eli nodded once. He did not smile. He did not seek reassurance or validation. He simply returned his attention to Charlotte, as if gratitude were secondary to vigilance. Charlotte shifted again, her brow furrowing slightly as she took in unfamiliar surroundings. Her breathing hitched once, then steadied. The volunteer murmured something about transport, about monitoring, about getting her to a hospital as soon as possible. Laura listened, nodding, absorbing instructions with an intensity she had not shown all day. Everything mattered now. The shelter no longer felt like an inconvenience. The heat no longer felt like an irritation. The people around her were no longer obstacles in her way. They were witnesses, and she was no longer separate from them. Eli finally stood, rolling his shoulders, grounding himself in the simple act of being upright again. His legs ached, his head throbbed faintly. He was suddenly aware of how young he felt, how close he had come to freezing under the weight of responsibility. He took a step back, giving space to the volunteer and to Laura, ready to fade into the background where he had been before. But Laura watched him move. She did not call after him. She did not demand his attention. She simply watched, letting the image of him, kneeling beside her daughter, hands steady, eyes focused, imprint itself permanently in her mind. This was not a lesson she would forget. Charlotte's eyes closed again, not in distress, but in the deep, necessary sleep of recovery. Her breathing remained steady. Her body no longer fought itself. Life had returned, not dramatically, not triumphantly, but quietly, insistently. Eli paused at the edge of the aisle and looked back one last time. Charlotte lay safe, surrounded by care, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Laura sat beside her, no longer commanding, no longer certain, only present. Eli turned away. The storm had taken many things from many people, but it had not taken this, and for now, that was enough. The ambulance arrived without ceremony. Its siren cut briefly through the evening air outside the shelter, then fell silent as it pulled up beside the gymnasium. Red lights flashed against the walls, casting intermittent color through the open doors. The sound drew attention, but not panic. In a place already shaped by loss and exhaustion, urgency had learned to move quietly. Charlotte was transferred carefully. A paramedic checked her vitals while another secured the stretcher. Her breathing remained steady. Her temperature, though still elevated, had dropped enough to ease immediate concern. She stirred once as they lifted her, eyes fluttering open for a moment before closing again. Laura walked beside the stretcher, one hand hovering near Charlotte's arm, unwilling to let go even when she no longer needed to hold on so tightly. Her face was pale, drawn, emptied of the sharp certainty that had defined her only hours earlier. When the ambulance doors closed, Laura stood still for a moment, watching the vehicle pull away. The red lights faded into the distance, swallowed by darkness and debris-strewn streets. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. Inside the shelter, people began talking, quietly at first, then in murmurs that moved from cot to cot, from volunteer to volunteer. The story took shape not as a dramatic retelling, but as fragments, observations stitched together by those who had seen it unfold. A child had seized, a teenager had stepped in, the girl was alive. Someone mentioned how calm he had been. Someone else talked about the way he'd known exactly what to do. A volunteer repeated the word RSV, unfamiliar, but now weighted with meaning. By the time Laura returned inside to gather her belongings, the shelter no longer felt quite the same. She moved differently now, slower, more attentive. She noticed things she had ignored before, the way volunteers leaned against walls when they thought no one was watching, the quiet resilience of parents soothing frightened children, the thin line separating order from collapse. She caught sight of Elijah near the water station, helping an older man steady himself as he stood. Eli moved with the same quiet efficiency as before, offering assistance without drawing attention, without waiting for acknowledgement. Laura stopped a few feet away. For a moment she said nothing. Apologies felt inadequate. Explanations felt offensive. There was no sentence that could undo what she had assumed, what she had said, what she had almost cost her daughter. So she chose something else. She thanked him again, simply and directly. No qualifiers, no attempt to soften her guilt, just the truth, offered without defense. Elijah nodded, accepting the words without ceremony. He returned to what he was doing, already focused on the next person who needed help. Laura watched him for a few seconds longer, then turned away. The hospital confirmed what Eli had suspected. High fever, a febrile seizure triggered by stress, dehydration, and heat. Charlotte would recover fully, the doctor said. She would need monitoring, rest, and care, but she would live. Laura sat beside her daughter's hospital bed through the night, listening to the steady rhythm of machines and breathing. She replayed the events again and again, each time stopping at the same point, the moment she had chosen certainty over listening. The weight of it settled deep. In the weeks that followed, the story continued to travel. It moved through local news outlets, through social media posts written by volunteers and parents, through quiet conversations in clinics and community centers. It was never framed as a miracle, never exaggerated into something it wasn't. It was told plainly: a child got sick, help came from an unexpected place, knowledge saved a life. Laura returned to her work changed, not publicly at first. There were no press releases, no speeches. Instead, she listened. She spoke with pediatric nurses, emergency responders, community organizers. She asked questions she had never thought to ask before. What did parents need most in emergencies? What information was missing? What could be taught before crisis struck? The answers were consistent: basic knowledge, clear guidance, confidence. Laura redirected resources accordingly. She funded and helped establish free pediatric first aid courses for mothers and caregivers, starting in communities most affected by hurricanes and flooding. The classes were practical, accessible, and designed to meet people where they were. How to recognize dangerous fever, what a seizure looks like, when to cool, and how. When to seek help immediately. No jargon, no assumptions, just knowledge, shared openly. Laura attended the first session quietly, sitting in the back of the room. She did not introduce herself. She listened as instructors explained concepts she now understood all too well. In the shelter, life moved forward. Repairs began. Families were relocated. Volunteers rotated out and new ones arrived. The chaos softened into something more manageable. Elijah stayed. He helped where he could, the same way he always had. He carried supplies, checked on kids with coughs, showed volunteers how to set up cots more efficiently. He did not tell the story unless asked, and even then he kept it brief. He didn't want attention. What he wanted was usefulness. Sometimes someone would recognize him. A nod, a quiet thank you, nothing more. That was enough. Weeks later, as the shelter finally began to empty, Elijah stood near the doors, watching families leave with what little they had salvaged. The gym felt larger now, echoes replacing noise. The storm's damage would take years to repair. Homes, roads, trust. But something else had been built in the aftermath. Something less visible, but no less important. Awareness. A mother who knew what fever really meant. A volunteer who listened longer. A child who survived because someone paid attention. Elijah stepped outside into the humid Florida air, the sky clear above him. The storm was gone. The debris remained, but so did the knowledge passed from one person to another, quietly, deliberately. After the hurricane, rebuilding would take time. But preventing the next tragedy would begin much sooner, with listening, with learning, with the simple understanding that help can come from anywhere, and that knowing what to do can matter as much as having the power to act. Eli walked down the steps and back into the world, unnoticed by most, and that was exactly how he wanted it.